On behalf of the Islesboro Forum Committee, welcome to the 7th and final program of the 2021 Islesboro Forum Speaker Series. I am Gail Jackson and the moderator of today's program. This is our 29th year of presenting distinguished speakers to the island community. We are doing this week's program in two formats: live in person at the Islesboro Community Center and on Zoom webinar. Please check out our website, islesboroforum.org, to view recorded videos of the programs we have already presented this summer. Before I introduce our speaker, I also want to acknowledge and thank the 7 other committee members for their excellent support and ideas, and our technical producer, Michael Hutcherson. Their names are listed on the website. Please consider making a donation to the forum. Our costs for 7 programs will be about $1,500, not counting the volunteer hours donated by the committee. We hope you will want to make a donation to help cover our costs and enable us to return next year to put on a speaker series in the summer of 2022. A quick reminder as to our format: once our speaker has completed her remarks, we will have time for Q&A. We will take questions from both the in-person audience and the remote attendees. For those on Zoom, please type your questions into the Q&A function on the bottom right of the Zoom webinar screen. Hit the enter button and the moderator will restate your question for our speaker to answer. Now, let's turn to tonight's program. Our speaker tonight has been writing about art, design, food, travel, traditional craftsmanship, rustic style, and the American West for more than 25 years. She's the author of 14 books. Her book, American Rustic, was named one of the best home design books of 2015 by Architectural Digest. You can find much more fascinating material at her website, which is ChaseReynoldsEwald.com. Along with these publishing and writing kudos, an additional claim to fame is that she is the daughter of beloved longtime Islesboro summer residents, Debbie and Russ Reynolds. In fact, their presence here on the island had a lot to do with how we were able to entice her to travel clear across the country from the Bay Area to speak in person at the forum. For tonight's program, she will be taking us inside one of her latest releases entitled Bison, Portrait of an Icon, which came out in March of 2021. With the help of stunningly beautiful photographs by her photographer collaborator, Audrey Hall, Chase Ewald will share with us how the bison has managed to come back from near extinction. After the program, Chase will be available to speak with you, and she will have copies of the book on bison for you to peruse and purchase. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Chase to the podium.
Thank you, Gail. And thank you all so much for coming out tonight during a hurricane. I know it hasn't really kicked in yet, but I just hope the power doesn't go out because my voice isn't nearly as beautiful as Audrey's photographs. Okay, so first off, how many here have ever been in a bison jam? Bison jam? Yes, a few. Okay, well, that's a good number, and I'm not surprised. I've noticed that the people who love the islands in Maine tend to like rugged places like the national parks and the Mountain West. Save that thought, we'll come back to it. So I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for my parents. No, I'm not making the obvious joke about the fact that they birthed me, nor am I talking about them introducing me to Islesboro. What I mean is, first they started me on riding lessons at age 7, and when I was 9, they took me to Colorado and Wyoming. Between my love of horses and what must have been a visceral response to ranch life, they then sent me for 3 summers to Teton Valley Ranch in Kelly, Wyoming. At that camp, you were either out in the mountains or waking up to the sight of the Tetons every morning for 6 whole weeks. For me, the experience was profound and set me on the path that I've been walking ever since. And that is either pining for the West, living in the West, working in the West, and or writing about the West. In the early 1990s, I was living on a 7,000-acre cattle ranch in Wapiti, Wyoming, running a nonprofit educational guest program and writing books and magazine articles. I had photographed my first 2 books myself, which, believe me, is not ideal. The next 2, I cobbled together images from various sources, which was even worse. The books were okay, but the process was very cumbersome. So I dreamt of finding a photographer I could do a book with. Audrey and I were working for many of the same publications, and she too had already done some books. And much to my delight, she said she'd love to do a book together. We actually ended up committing to 2 books at once, a cookbook and an interiors book, and we've now collaborated on 6 books. Over time, I got married, and Charles and I moved to Northern California, where we had 4 babies in 5 years. Audrey lives in Livingston, Montana, just north of Yellowstone National Park. So our adventures over the years have taken place in all kinds of locales, in all circumstances, and in almost all weather. We've done author photos at art galleries, in national parks, and on bison ranches. We've done social media planning at cafes in Livingston, Tiburon, Santa Fe, and Greenwich, site visits and shoots in Big Sky, Big Sur, Jackson Hole, California, and New York. And we've been hosted at book launch parties on both coasts and throughout the West and Southwest. We've even signed books in a snowstorm on the side of a mountain, although not yet in a hurricane. The Bison book was a significant departure for us. Until now, we've been mainly known for our design books. It was time to stretch ourselves in a new direction. And when one of our editors suggested an equine book, Audrey quickly countered with a proposal on bison. She had grown up summering in a little cabin in Silver Gate, a tiny mining town next to Yellowstone, where she and her parents would drive into the Lamar Valley every night with a picnic and eat dinner among the bison. Like every other Easterner who grows west at an impressionable age, I had been struck by these magnificent beasts from the first sight. During my dude ranching and wilderness outfitting years, I regularly encountered all the other big ungulates. Elk, antelope, deer, and moose were regular features of our early morning wrangles when I worked on ranches outside Cody, Wyoming. But bison I'd only see when I drove through or when I took ranch guests on tours of the park. For a recent article in Hotchkiss magazine, the editor asked why I had wanted to do this book. I wrote, "Imagine you're picnicking at a table next to the Yellowstone River on a sunny summer day. Suddenly aware of a disturbance, you turn, only to see a mass of heaving, snorting, splashing creatures swimming forcefully, inexorably, and directly at you. Retreating to cover is not an option. You're already becoming engulfed in a powerful mass of animals whose soft grunting and collective rumbling and scrabbling hooves immediately drown out the sound of birdsong and rushing water. They pass so closely by you could reach out and touch their prehistoric-looking leathery sides. Then they move on, ignoring you, singularly focused on moving with the herd, following their leader to some unknown destination." This actually happened to me one day. I was chaperoning some guests through the park, and we'd stop for lunch. You always expect to see bison in Yellowstone, maybe even feel them brush up against your car on the road during one of the park's famous bison jams. But you don't anticipate them practically running you over when you're enjoying a sandwich at a picnic table. I can't say this was the moment I became fascinated with bison, but it was one of the reasons that when I was offered a chance in 2019 by our longtime publisher, Gibbs Smith, to collaborate on a book about bison, I immediately said yes. The book is a balance between Audrey's spectacular photographs and my extended essay, plus contributions from a diverse cast of Western characters. The essay discusses the importance of bison to Native American people and follows the thread of bison through American culture. It describes the loss of millions of bison in a relentless slaughter in the late 19th century, the efforts to save the few remaining, and the flourishing of conservation and ranch herds today. We included voices from around the country, ranchers, including Native American ranchers, tribal herd managers, policymakers, such as the head of the World Wildlife Fund's Bison Initiative, and industry groups like the National Bison Association. We augmented the essay and photos with quotes from significant figures in conservation and land management, like Patagonia founder Yvon Chouinard, former Secretary of the Interior Sally Jewell, head of the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum Kirk Johnson, and well-known writer Todd Wilkinson, who wrote the book on Ted Turner's bison ranching and his bison forward restaurant chain called Ted's Montana Grill. John Hemingway, a close friend of both of ours and a Bozeman resident who is an author, filmmaker, and longtime PBS presenter, and he's also an expert on African wildlife, wrote the foreword. Because Native voices are such an integral part of this conversation, we wanted to include a contribution from Montana poet laureate Henry Reelbird, a member of the Crow tribe. He wrote a poem for the book called Buffalo Talk, and also shared excerpts from his book in progress. In this excerpt, he speaks of a dream from tribal lore foretelling the advance of white settlers, the proliferation of cattle on the plains, and the loss of the buffalo. A spirit voice then said to Plenty Coup, "There it is, the buffalo will be no more, and the spotted buffalo will now eat the buffalo grass. The many lodges moving camp on the trail of the buffalo will be gone forevermore. The big wind that knocked down all the pine trees, except for the one pine tree the chickadee was on, is representative of the many light-eyed people who emerged from the morning sacred sunrise. If you get rid of some of these people, many more will come. You have to learn to live with them, be like the chickadee, sit quietly and observe and learn from these light-eyed people. There it is. Tell your people the buffalo will disappear." So why bison? What is so special about them? Why are they as emblematic of America as the bald eagle? Well, first, there's something about their look and those ancient, all-knowing eyes. They have a prehistoric mien. Their leathery hides have a whisper of the woolly mammoth about them. There's something incredibly powerful about their herd strength and the way they inhabit vast landscapes. They're hardy and perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions of the mountains and Great Plains. They've evolved to adapt to extreme cold. Up to 40 degrees below zero, they're still comfy. The humps at their shoulders are basically huge muscles which allow them to use their heads as snowplows so they can get to the grass beneath a heavy snowfall. They are matriarchal, with the whole herd acting to protect the weak and the young. And although they appear to be placid and lumbering, they are full of surprises. Bison are capable of sprinting 35 miles an hour, clearing fence-high obstacles, and fording glacier-fed rivers with their calves during the height of spring runoff. Audrey Hall has often said that she's not a wildlife photographer. She's an artist inspired by bison and the land. The photographs in Bison show the animals in incomparably beautiful settings. They include photodocumentary style images and work from her thought-provoking art installations. They include art images because Audrey is a fine artist as well as a photographer. and they address sense of place in the Western landscape. In 2016, the bison was named the national mammal, and that may be part of the reason the Bison book has met with a lot of interest. It sold out of its first printing by the March publication date earlier this year, and is now in its third. Articles have been published or are in the works in a diverse group of publications, including a number of Western ones, but also things like the Social Register and Hotchkiss Magazine and Mountain Living. Many of the publications have been especially interested in our body of work and this collaboration between me and Audrey. And here is where I'll say a word about bison versus buffalo. The early non-native people, upon first seeing the animals, called them buffalo, and the name stuck. There are two schools of thought on this. One is that, to the French fur trappers, they resembled cattle, i.e. boeuf in French. The other is that they resembled the buffalo found in Africa and Asia. So today they go by both names. More casually, you'll often hear them referred to as buffalo, and native peoples refer to them as buffalo. At scientific conferences, they're called by their proper name, bison. But whatever you call them, the fact is that the largest land mammal native to the US, once numbering 40 million, was all but wiped out, slaughtered at the rate of one creature every 30 seconds for 40 years. Also in the documentary world, Ken Burns is currently at work on a 4-hour film on the animals, set for release in 2024. We like to say, and we hope, that now is the bison's moment for recognition, understanding, and hopefully a continued resurgence. So what happened to the bison? Bison are descendants of the same ancient species depicted on cave art in Europe. Over the millennia, they've evolved to what we know today, massive beasts. The bulls can weigh 2,000 pounds, covered in incredibly warm, dense fur, and equipped with short, lethal horns. As Kirk Johnson describes in his contribution to the book, like many North Americans, bison are the descendants of immigrants. Somewhere around 200,000 years ago, small herds of bison grazed their way east across Beringia, the broad grassy steppe that connected Eastern Asia to Alaska when the sea level was 300 feet lower than it is today. Then, for tens of thousands of years, they lived in a land full of other large mammals, like mammoths, mastodons, camels, giant ground sloths, horses, stag moose, helmeted muskox, short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, and bear-sized beavers. That one really conjures an image that's kind of frightening. It was only about 12,000 years ago that these other species departed or became extinct, and the bison inherited the Great Plains and the surrounding woodlands. By this time, people had arrived, traveling the same route from Asia, and a whole new chapter of the American bison had begun. In the early 1800s, it was estimated that bison inhabited virtually all of what is now the United States, from east to west, from north to south, in numbers ranging from 30 to 60 million. The lives of native peoples, particularly the Plains tribes, were inextricably linked to bison. My friend Kathy Smith is an Emmy Award-winning costume designer who grew up in South Dakota among the Lakota Sioux. She explains, "Buffalo are wholly sacred and central to life. Everything involves the buffalo. Buffalo horn spoons are used for sacred food. We use the sinew for sewing sacred things. A buffalo skull serves as the altar. Painted wearing robes were your coats. Teepees were made from cow buffalo hides. The horns became cups, and the toes were made into rattles. Every single part of the buffalo was used." She speaks in the present as well as the past tense, because for some tribes, even after the bison had been gone for a century, they've remained central to their belief systems. A few short decades changed the lives of Native peoples as they knew it. First came the explorers, fur traders, and trappers. Then army forts were established. The railroad advanced across the land, dividing the bison population into a great northern and southern herd. Hunters were hired to feed the railroad workers. They slaughtered the animals, hundreds at a time. Buffalo Bill Cody became famous for his Wild West shows, which traveled the world. The shows featured buffalo hunts and iconography, although by then the bison had been virtually wiped out. But Cody got his nickname as a buffalo hunter. When supplying meat on contract for the Kansas Pacific Railroad, he reportedly killed 4,280 bison in 18 months. The hide hunters came next. By the 1870s, an insatiable demand for leather in European and American factories spelled doom for the bison, as carcasses were left rotting on the open plain. After that, the bone pickers scoured the plains for skulls and skeletons, gathering them into enormous piles for shipment east to aid in the production of sugar and fertilizer, as many as 30 million pounds in just a few years. This extirpation was tacitly, sometimes overtly, encouraged by the government, which sought to subject the native peoples while clearing the way for homesteading, farming, and cattle ranching. Ultimately, only a tiny remnant herd was left undisturbed in Yellowstone Park, with more animals across the border in Canada. There were a few bison here and there, mostly in captivity. Some were in zoos. The Bronx Zoo and early East Coast conservationists, including William Hornaday and President Teddy Roosevelt, who together founded the American Bison Society in 1905, took steps to preserve them. There were also individuals who took the initiative to save some animals on private or tribal lands. Some of these form the basis for crucial breeding stock today. For all their scarcity, bison have made a huge impact on our society. Everyone knows what they look like, even if they've never seen one. The buffalo nickel was coined in 1913. James Earl Fraser chose the bison as the subject of his design, even though at the time there were only a couple thousand of animals left. Later, in a 1947 radio interview, he said, "When I was asked to do a nickel, I felt I wanted to do something totally American, a coin that could not be mistaken for any other country's coin. It occurred to me that the buffalo, as part of our Western background, was 100% American." From turn-of-the-century megastars like Buffalo Bill Cody, from towns named Buffalo, to mascots, to bands, to bars, in the US, in some form, bison are still ubiquitous. There are three major developments happening around bison, and none of them are simply about bison. All are inextricably linked to the health of the land and the goals of biodiversity. On tribal land, there's a third goal, the reclaiming of tradition and culture. First, one needs to understand the way bison evolve with the land and what they can do for it. Bison are considered ecosystem engineers. Of the roughly 500,000 bison on the continent today, only about 4% of those are in conservation herds. The rest are raised for meat, breeding, and controlled hunting. But whether the animals are there to roam or breed or are being raised for meat, they do their part for the land. According to Dennis Jorgensen, the World Wildlife Fund's Bison Initiative Coordinator, quote, "By restoring bison, you're creating an umbrella for all the other occupants of the land." Dr. Danny Kinka of the American Prairie Reserve says bison are ecosystem engineers partly due to their manner of grazing and the ways in which they move across the landscape, and partly because of their habit of wallowing. Bison create depressions in the earth that they then roll in to cool off, shed fur, rid themselves of parasites, scratch their backs on a treeless plain, and mark their territory. They often urinate in the wallows, especially during the fall rut. They'll continue to use the same spots year after year, which creates permanent intermittent wetlands. The inadvertent effects of this behavior on the ecosystem are enormous, from carrying seeds picked up in the animals' coats from one location and transporting them to another, to literally creating habitat. The bison's symbiotic relationship to the prairie is key to its recovery, says Dan O'Brien, a South Dakota writer, rancher, and former wildlife biologist. In his book, Buffalo for the Broken Heart, he wrote, "From the beginning, I saw that the welfare of the Great Plains wildlife species depended ultimately on grass. The health of the grass dictated the health of the birds I was studying, and ultimately all the animals on the prairie food chain. Great Plains plants evolve to be healthiest when herds trample and graze them intensively and then move on. The large native herbivore, the buffalo, evolved to stick close together, initially as a form of protection from predators, and so give the grasses of the Great Plains exactly what they need to thrive." Grasslands that thrive carry an invisible benefit for all of us: carbon sequestration. The green vegetation in a healthy buffalo pasture represents only the visible portion of the plant life, while the roots beneath the ground are perennial and live through the winter. That plant matter draws carbon dioxide from the air, breaks the carbon atom from the oxygen atoms, sends the oxygen back into the atmosphere, and holds the carbon in the ground. As long as the carbon remains sequestered, it can't exacerbate global warming. Dan O'Brien was cattle ranching on marginal land in South Dakota, and he found himself running the ranch with one caretaker in between teaching gigs to pay the mortgage. He thought there had to be a better way. After spending time on a large bison ranch, he ended up taking a small group of 13 orphaned bison home with him. That was the start of Wild Idea Buffalo Company, which now manages its own bison herds on several ranches on the North Plains and has forged partnerships with another half-dozen bison ranches in 4 states, helping bison thrive on as many as 200,000 acres of grasslands. Wild Idea bison are kept as close to wild as possible. They're handled only once a year, and when harvested are taken down in the field by one extremely precise shooter from a long distance away so as not to upset the herd. Hormone and antibiotic-free, grass-fed, grass-finished, and humanely harvested, the meat is about as healthy and ethical and close to wild as possible. And meanwhile, the prairie is responding. Colton Jones, O'Brien's son-in-law, manages one of Wild Idea's large ranches. He says, "We never used to see magpies. Now we see them daily. Short-tailed grouse are much more plentiful. Plant species diversity has increased, and there are more native grasses, and in drought years, they do better. And the population density of wildlife has increased as well, such as with pronghorns and coyotes and prairie dogs, which keep the grass consistently shooting up with new growth. The wallows provide a place for water to pool, and you see more wildlife around those areas. Even if a puddle is there for just a couple of weeks, it provides a place for a duck to stop on a fly-through. A lot of that is pasture management, but I believe that putting a keystone species back on the land is like putting a missing piece back into something that was broken." Chris Bechtold, who has a degree in wildlife management, managed cattle ranches before being hired by some Easterners who had read about the benefits of grazing bison. The Diamond 4D near Choteau, Montana, now runs about 700 head in a place where conditions can be extreme. He says, "Bison are the perfect animal for this environment. Yesterday, we had 15 inches of snow and 40-mile-per-hour winds. It's damp, wet, and dipped below zero for a couple of days in a row. That's pretty harsh for mid-April, but I don't worry a bit about them. The first calf hit the ground yesterday and it's healthy. I went out today and they're digging through the snow, perfectly content. If I were still a cattle rancher, I'd be worrying. But bison evolved to do exactly what they're doing right now." Bison manage their own calving, something that keeps most cattle ranchers up in the middle of the night in inclement weather, sometimes for weeks on end. Bison have smaller calves than cows do, but the bison calves have a faster growth rate. Also, bison don't rely solely on hay for winter feed. If enough grass has been left behind for winter grazing, small amounts of supplemental hay can easily get them through the winter months. Standing Rock Sioux Indian Reservation straddles the border of North Dakota and South Dakota. There, Ron Brown Otter, who is of Lakota Yanktonai descent, runs 600 head of buffalo over 20,000 acres. Brown Otter served in the U.S. Marine Corps and was attending college in California while running cattle on his family land, 320 acres that had been passed down from his grandmother to his father. During a class project, he got interested in bison and made the leap. 2 decades later, his land is flourishing. We have birds, insects, snakes, coyotes, badgers, deer, skunk, even wolves and moose, prairie dogs, eagles, hawks, lots of wildlife. And his bison ranch is believed to be the largest such enterprise solely owned by an American Indian in the US or Canada. He even hosts his own auction, selling 375 calves and yearlings each year. Brown Otter's success has inspired others, and the Standing Rock Sioux Indian Reservation now has its own community-owned buffalo herd. He finds fulfillment in raising buffalo. I describe it like putting on a glove. It fits my hand. My culture, the land, the buffalo are all mixed together, and I feel my mission today is to raise them and bring them back and just be a help to my community, my family, the reservation as a whole, and to know that the buffalo have returned. When in the spring of 1805, the Lewis and Clark expedition first passed through the spectacular Missouri Breaks region, they encountered vast herds of bison. As settlers moved on to the plains and bison were virtually exterminated, other charismatic megafauna, grizzlies, mountain lions, elk, were displaced to the mountains, while nuisance animals and predators, such as prairie dogs, coyotes, and wolves, were enthusiastically poisoned and shot. Some of the land was given over to grazing and some to farming, but in much of this region, the native grasslands are untilled. 2 decades ago, a group of conservationists conceived of a project to protect a large swath of this region, one of the world's last intact grassland ecosystems. They envisioned creating a vast wildlife preserve to restore the ecosystem and the species that evolved there. Their vision can be imagined on a map as a 3.2 million acre rectangle through which the Missouri River flows from west to east. Up to 500,000 acres of private land would be combined with a patchwork of otherwise protected lands, including the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation and public lands such as the Charles M. Russell Wildlife Preserve, the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument, and National Forest and BLM lands. It would create the largest wildlife preserve in the continental US. Fences would be removed, pronghorn antelope and prairie dogs protected, and bison herds would be reestablished. Ultimately, other species would follow. This would be possible because, unlike most of the United States, says Dr. Kinka, the foundation of our ecosystem remains largely intact. It's changed drastically over 150 years, but by and large, the grasslands are still there, and they have tons of capacity to support large amounts of wildlife. The story is fascinating, and the place is indescribably vast, beautiful, and inspiring. I was lucky enough to canoe down the Missouri through the Missouri River Breaks National Monument, then spend 3 days at the reserve. I could talk a lot about this project, but instead, I just highly recommend a visit. Concurrent with this push to create a vast grassland with free-roaming bison has been a move toward restoring bison on native lands. Dr. Ian and Amy Thompson founded Nanawaya Heritage Foundation on Choctaw tribal lands in Oklahoma. The name refers to the tribe's creation story, in which the people were given rules for how to live in balance with the land and with each other. When they bought their land, Dr. Thompson says, it was almost nothing but ragweed and goatweed. The land was so heavily grazed that certain keystone plant species were gone. It was out of balance. Their goal is to heal the land, support the community, and bring to light the traditional knowledge of their Choctaw ancestors, and they use bison as a tool to achieve these goals. The farmstead hosts campouts, cultural plant walks, and classes on traditional arts. The Thompsons have also produced a book on Choctaw foods and sustainable landscape management. They knew they were making an impact when a group of traditional skills practitioners collected buffalo wool on the farmstead, then made a traditional Choctaw skirt from the wool, a cultural expression that hadn't been practiced in that way in 200 years. Within 5 years of careful management, the land started to bounce back. The Thompsons let it lie fallow for a year, then put bison on the land and managed their movements. They now count 120 species of native prairie grasses and forbs. Dr. Thompson says, when you think about indigenous cultures, they're based on 15,000 years of living on the land. They contain timeless insights that can help modern people have a higher quality of life. Food is the most direct connection between people and the land. Societies managed to live on the land without degrading it for thousands of years, but in 200 years of industrial agriculture, we've obliterated it in huge chunks in the world. Our goal is to connect our farm with the broader cultural revitalization and hopefully get people interested in indigenous foods and in doing things that bring balance and sustainability to the community. There is still much confusion and controversy around bison. If you travel to the American Prairie Reserve, you'll see signs indicating that some local ranchers feel threatened. They worry their hunting rights might be taken away, or that the ultimate plan might be to turn all of Montana into a national park. Meanwhile, other local ranchers are fully on board with the programs, installing wildlife-friendly fencing on their property and allowing the preserve to install game cameras on their fences, for which the preserve sends them a check every time certain wild animals are captured on film. There are many interesting and difficult issues, which I'm no expert on, and which we don't attempt to address in this book, and I won't go into now, but I can direct you to excellent resources and publications should you wish to know more. One of the big questions, though, has to do with this notion of bison being saved behind a fence. This refers to the reality that all bison in the US are either literally or virtually fenced. Elk, deer, bighorn sheep, and antelope are allowed to migrate at will. And although obviously their numbers and movements are severely curtailed by development and hunting, there are still herds following their ancient migration paths. We won't go into the brucellosis debate here. That is a disease carried by elk and bison that, when transmitted to cattle, can cause abortions. There's been no documented case of a bison transmitting brucellosis to cattle, and bison are regularly tested, while elk are allowed to wander at will. Nevertheless, bison, which evolved to migrate, are allowed to be shot down when they step over the Yellowstone border to the north, when they seek forage in the winter. It's not a pretty picture, and it reflects a complicated situation which I won't attempt to parse here. This book is, after all, a celebration of the animal. So about those bison jams, which I promised I would return to. Even before the COVID pandemic, there was a fear that our national parks were being loved to death. With COVID, numbers of visitors have increased, even as supplies and a shortage of workers have made serving them more challenging. In Yellowstone, the world's first national park, there were more than 1 million visitors last month alone. This hasn't boded well for bison visitor interactions. For years and years, every visitor to Yellowstone has been handed their receipt, a map, an informational newsletter, and on top of the stack, one of these bright yellow flyers. You really can't miss it. Nevertheless, every summer, visitors get too close. Last week, I saw a video clip of a woman being whirled around like a figure skater in a pairs competition. Only her partner was a bison who had hooked his horn on her blue jeans. When it was over, she was lying on the ground, pantsless, and had to be airlifted to the hospital in Billings. On the park website, you can find a video of a man who gets too close, being flung like a doll, overhead and upside down into the branches of a nearby lodgepole pine. Bison on ranches, if properly handled, know their handlers and understand what's needed without anyone getting too close. Matt Skoglund of North Bridger Bison moves them by himself, by pulling rather than suggesting they move, creating an opportunity for them to move rather than pushing them, which is typically done with cattle, with people on horses or ATVs, with dogs nipping at their heels. But none of that is necessary with bison. On the Quapaw Reservation in Oklahoma, the tribe built their own processing plant so that the animals wouldn't have to endure the stress of being transported. And they hired renowned animal behaviorist Temple Grandin to design the most modern and humane handling facilities. Bison on conservation lands like the American Prairie Reserve are left as wild as possible, so they will start moving off when they detect people a quarter mile away. Bison in parks, however, deal with visitors all day long. They will graze near buildings, share the roadways with cars and snowmobiles, and they might brush against a visitor eating lunch at a picnic table if that person is along their path. In short, they will usually ignore people as they have no real predators and are generally pretty invincible. But bison are still wild animals. They can appear to be as placid as a milk cow one moment, then spin and charge the next. And as I mentioned earlier, they can sprint up to 35 miles an hour. The result is headlines like these every year. Whatever your interaction, and this is hopefully true, even if you only see them in our book, bison are magnificent animals, perfectly at one with their environment. As Yvonne Chouinard said, more than an icon, wild, free-roaming bison are our family elders who teach by example, if only we will listen. In a recent presentation to a group of philanthropists involved with Yellowstone National Park, Audrey Hall said, "The process of writing the book reminded me of how invaluable nature is to us and how so many species depend on each other and how they all, one way or another, rely on us." She says, "I learned so much about the nuance in the relationship between bison and humans. Bison depend on your support to continue their comeback. Their story and the challenges that face them are not over. The process takes time, energy, resources, understanding, and support so that this national mammal, this great symbol of resilience and strength, can have its next chapter." On my part, I hope you'll get a chance to see bison in the wild, and I again encourage anyone who seeks an off-the-beaten-path adventure to plan a trip to the American Prairie Reserve, where you can pitch your own tent or stay in a 5-star yurt camp. Bison are iconic symbols of resilience and fortitude. They're inseparable from the vast open spaces of the American West. They're good for the land, and they're good for us. And hopefully they're here to stay. Thank you. Hi, Francie, yes?
That was great.
Thank you.
To add one more benefit that the buffalo produces for the hungry camper out on wild prairie with not a tree in sight and a whole half-pound of bacon to cook. What does he use? He uses a buffalo chip.
Buffalo chips, yes. Okay, Francie has,
Tell him what it is.
Francie has, thank you for that. Yeah, there's just so much to say about them. You can't fit it all in, but Francie has pointed out that for hunters or campers or people stuck out on the plain without, and they have some great meat or food or freeze-dried packet food and nothing to create a fire with because it's a treeless plain. They make their fires out of buffalo chips, which is dried, desiccated buffalo dung, and that they were gathered up by the westward, settlers in the wagon trains. The women were wearing the long skirts, and they'd stack them up in their skirts and then go make the fires when they were out on the plains. Thank you for that. Anybody else?
First off, thank you so much for coming out here. This is great. I can't wait to get my hands on the books. What can we be looking forward to from you in the future?
He asks, what can what can you be looking forward to from me in the future? Well, it's been a really interesting process because, as I said, Audrey and I had done a lot of interior and design books, and I'd really been focused on traditional craftsmanship and art early in my career, done a couple of cookbooks. And the Bison book has been great because it pushed us into a whole new zone, a little bit out of my comfort zone. It was a big project to wrap my arms around, and it was a great thing to do, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity. And now I seem to be in a place where a lot of different types of things are coming my way, and I've been asked I'm working on 2 books right now that are coming out next year, and both of them are private commissions, which is different from contracting with a publisher and they pay you in advance and you get a share of royalties. This is more a situation where I've been contracted to produce a book and work with a publisher who then is being paid to produce the book, but the books will be commercial books that are available, in stores and libraries and museums and things like that. One of them is on a 27,000 acre cattle ranch in Santa Barbara County. And it's a historic Mexican land grant ranch. And the woman who is one of the co-owners wanted to do a book to mark the 70th anniversary of her family owning this ranch, as well as the 50th anniversary of her father planting grapes in Santa Barbara County. And he was one of the first to do so, and they have a very successful winery and wine club. In addition to being a major ranch, they run cattle just like in the old days of the Mexican rule, but they also have gravel, and they've had asphalt and other things. So they farm 200 acres of vegetables. That 200 acres are leased to a local farmer. So there's a lot going on there. It's really interesting. The other book is I was hired by a nonprofit organization in Wyoming that is focused on the Western decorative arts, which is something I've been writing about for almost 30 years. And this is a group that wants to commemorate the 30th anniversary of their organization and really establish Cody, Wyoming's legacy and sort of place of prominence in that world. So both of those are coming out next year, and it's a whole new, as I say, it's a new direction. I'm finding it interesting doing these commission projects. And I think,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question
okay,
from Bruce Claflin. How might climate change impact bisons either directly or through changes in habitat?
okay, how might climate change affect bison directly or indirectly? Well, it's, there are a lot of pieces to that. In areas where there are fires, which is most of the Mountain West. We obviously see less of that in the grasslands and more of it in the forested areas, which is, other than Yellowstone, the bison aren't really there. That's a big threat if they cannot flee, which, as we talked about, they're safe behind a fence. I mean, they can trample a fence, they can run through a fence, but that's an issue if their habitat is taken up, and there's less water and there's more fire danger. That's an impact. Although, again, it's mostly in the parks and less in places like the American Prairie Reserve. I don't know a lot about how climate change so far has been affecting the Great Plains. Obviously, it's affecting the whole world and all habitats. And I will delve into that because that's a really interesting question. I have not heard a lot about drought conditions on the Great Plains affecting bison. I think they're extremely hardy and they've lived for a really, really long time and evolved in these conditions, and lived through different cycles, warmer and drier and wetter cycles. So I think that if anybody can survive, it's probably the bison, as long as they have, room to roam and reproduce. Obviously, they need forage, but they can travel really far, and they don't, eat. They graze in such a way it's good for the land, so they're less so compared to cattle or something. There's more to go around, and they don't stay in one area and degrade it, and then move on, and then come back to that area. So all this is it's a little bit of a rambling response to an important question.
Thank you for that. Are there people with hands raised there? I have a couple more back here, but I can't see if you've got some.
I've got one here.
Okay, go ahead with that.
They're just amazing in such an unusual way, mammals, but their coats, I don't know how you can explain the texture of their fur and coats and why. It looks like they're almost shedding, or why there isn't fur in some areas and others have full fur. Is that seasonal? Is that random?
Both, I think. Yeah, it's a bit seasonal and a bit random, but it is amazing. They have these leathery hides, and then the fur falling off in strips. But then in the winter, they need a full. Yeah. And when you see a buffalo robe, they're pretty uniform and dense. So I think they're harvested at certain times of it. Back in the day, they were taken at certain times of the year.
So they weren't shorn, right?
No. Yes?
Can buffalo be herded on horseback the way cattle are handled?
Oh, can buffalo be herded on horseback the way cattle are? Not a good idea. I think they could. If I were to do it, I would not bring the dogs, and I would have just a couple of other people, and you would fan out from a real distance and gently suggest that they go that way, and they would move away from you, and maybe they would find the gate that you want them to go through. But that's not the way these people are doing it, at least the ones I've spoken to. And I talked about how Matt Skoglund can move the bison all by himself, no dog, no horse, no ATV, and he says they're really smart. And a number of the people who work with bison have told me that they're really smart, and they get the gist. And you have to, and the leader, they all follow the leader. So they have this incredible herd instinct, and they just want to be together. And the leader is usually a really smart, wise female, and they know him, or they know they generally know their handlers, and he will create the opportunity for them to move into the next pasture by opening the gate, and they go. And it's really cool to see, because the first ones will sort of walk through or trot a bit, and then all of a sudden there's a whole mass of them thundering through this, narrow opening, when they could easily take the fence down but they just go right through. So I think, it'd be interesting to know. I didn't talk to managers on the big commercial operations, and it would be interesting to know what they do, but yes, pull
Chase.
rather than push.
Chase?
Yes, Gail.
We're getting a flurry of questions here, and we're running out of time. I'm going to choose one that particularly interested me, the American Prairie Reserve. Carol Pearson asks, in this vast preserve, where does one go to experience it? Do you drive through? What's a logical way to get your hands around it?
The question's about the American Prairie Reserve, which is in north central Montana. And the question is how to experience it. Do you drive through, camp, whatever? It is pretty far from everywhere. And it is really, I don't want to say the word empty, but there's not a lot, once you get there, there's some small towns, there's some farms, there's some cattle ranches, and there's a lot of land that literally has never been tilled. Because by the time the settlers got there and were tilling, the Great Plains, they figured out that this was not a good idea. And so a lot of this land has never been tilled, and it's an amazing landscape. It's just beautiful and vast. And as far as experiencing it, there are a number of ways to do it with the American Prairie Reserve. And if you go to their website, there's all kinds of great information and videos on there. But the short answer is you can camp. They've created really nice campsites with facilities like water and bathrooms that are free, as good or better than any state park campground, but they're free. And I think you might have to register before you go, but you may just have to register once you arrive. I can't remember. So you can camp for free there if you drive and bring a tent and your own food, because there's no facilities nearby nowhere to buy food or check your internet. But you can also, they're building a series of huts, so you can do hut to hut hiking. I don't know if they allow mountain biking, but that would be really fun. Bring your gear and, bike or hike from one hut to the next and do a circuit. The most wonderful, luxurious way to experience it is they have this 5-star yurt camp. I think they're about 4 or 5 yurts. They're luxury yurts. It's like going to Africa on safari. It's just magical, really, really special. And they bring in a chef for those. They can sleep up to 10 people. I think they might have expanded it a little bit since I was there. Maybe it's 12 or 15. And they'll bring a chef in from Bozeman for the time that you're there, and all the meals are catered, prepared by the chef, and it's really great. Really, really nice. So there are many ways to visit, and I strongly encourage everyone to go to their website. The other thing they're doing is building a visitor center in Lewiston, Montana, which is not that far from the Prairie Reserve, but it's closer to some of the major cities like Billings and Bozeman. And that'll be, it's kind of a museum where people can learn more.
Thank you. I think we're going to need to.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chase. You can tell from the questions, and there were 4 or 5 I couldn't get to on from the remote audience. I felt a little bit better about this audience because you'll be here. You'll be right out in the hallway if some of you have some more follow-up questions that you'd like to go to. But it just, you transported us from the down East Coast to the vast plains of the West, and just reminded us all again of the great beauty of this country. And your explanation of what's happening with the bison is just so revealing and so interesting. It opens so many doors for us to follow up on. So thank you very much. And thank you to the Reynolds parents for encouraging her to come also. So now I just have a few closing remarks. We've had many very appreciative comments from people over the weeks that we've had the forum, and I think that they are energizing us to be favorably inclined to take a shot at doing this again in the summer of 2022. So we're delighted that you have appreciated it, and that's what makes it all worthwhile. We will be welcoming your ideas for speakers and any other suggestions and comments that you have for improvement. We've had some wonderful help in just the last week or so from Amy German, who's a great social media person. So if some of you have noticed a little more lively Instagram posts, etc., it's with her help, and we're grateful for that volunteer assistance that you've given us. We hope to make that an even more important part of our outreach in the months ahead. So with that, I thank you for coming this evening. It's been delightful to have you in person. It's been wonderful to have you remotely as well, your questions and interests over the summer. And I wish you well and a good, healthy, safe winter. And that's it.